Hello and good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this seminar in the seminar series of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute. My name is Martin Ruhs. I'm Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Laura Peitz with us today, who will talk about her paper on rejected but not yet returning immobility trajectories of rejected asylum seekers in Germany. Laura is a researcher at the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, where she conducts mixed methods research on the immobility of rejected asylum seekers from West Africa. And previously, Laura worked at International Security and Development Center in Berlin as part of a research project on the integration of Syrian refugees in Jordan. Laura holds a bachelor in political and administrative science from the University of Constance, a master in international relations from the Free University of Berlin, and a PhD from the Hertie School. So Laura, thank you very much for taking the time to present your work today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for showing up online and here in person. Yeah, as Martin has already said, my name is Laura Peitz. I'm a researcher at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in Germany. And I think, okay, I have to click here. No. How does it work? Elena said I should click here. Even though we've spent 4 years now with, where did you?
I think it was
this one? Because, yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. So I have another title slide, which we don't really need. Before I start with introducing the study specifically, I would just take a couple of moments to basically present where this is coming from. As I said, I'm a researcher at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, which the German acronym is BAMF, and I think that's also the name that if somebody knows it by, they know it by this acronym. We were basically the agency in Germany that is responsible for for processing the asylum claims of refugees in Germany. And we do have a research department, which is called the Research Center of the BAMF, which has grown considerably over the past years. And I'm a researcher there. And we do policy-oriented research on different migration and integration topics. We seek to inform policymakers in Germany. We carry out evaluations and so on. And one of our current projects is MIMAP, which again is the German acronym. And the title would translate into English into something like a feasibility study of the immobility of persons obliged to leave the country. This obliged to leave the country is relatively bulky in English. It's a bit shorter in German. And I'm part of that research project together with 2 of my colleagues. And it has been going on for almost 3 years now and will finish probably in May next year. And the target group of that research project are rejected asylum seekers in Germany. And I will go into this into more detail in a minute, but rejected asylum seekers are obliged to leave the country from a legal perspective, but usually they stay in Germany for considerable times and usually with something that is called a tolerated stay. And it's definitely a pretty hard to reach target group and hard to survey target group for, I guess, all researchers, but especially for researchers who come from the agency that has rejected their asylum claims, right? So it was something like an experiment to us to see how and whether we can even reach them. So the aim of our project is basically twofold. It's content related in a sense that we yes, okay. That we seek to analyze the immobility aspirations and decision-making of this target group, but also there's a methodological aim. No worries. Now it's working? Okay, thank you. A methodological aim of exploring the empirical access to this, as I said, very hard to reach target group. Okay, so just as a short background to the project, we relied on both secondary data analyses and primary data analyses. The secondary data analyses basically cover all asylum seekers in Germany or rejected asylum seekers in Germany from all countries of origin. And the primary data analyses, in those we focus specifically on rejected asylum seekers from West Africa, what Martin has said in the introduction. And the secondary data analyses, there's like a twofold approach. We did analyses on data from the Central Register of Foreigners in Germany, and also we used data from the EIB BAMF survey of refugees, which is a representative panel survey of refugees in Germany, which has been ongoing, I think, for 8 years now. And then for the primary data analyses, it's again twofold. On the one side, we developed a relatively innovative approach of a respondent-driven sampling, which is something like a controlled snowball sampling, and usually done in person, but we kind of shifted it to a digital space and developed an app that can be used to do the survey. And yeah, collected survey data through that app. And then my colleague also did ethnographic research with rejected asylum seekers from West Africa. And what I'm talking about today, so now it's getting more specific, is this analysis that is based on the Central Register of Foreigners. And there's a paper that's already published. It's something like a policy paper, but it's only published in German so far. On what I'm talking about today, the trajectories or patterns of immobility of rejected asylum seekers. So with no further ado, about the study, I'm just briefly going to introduce the motivation behind this research. What does the literature tell us? Where are the gaps? And as I said, what is a brief legal background on rejected asylum seekers in Germany? I will then present the data and methods that I used and present some of the results that I found. And then, of course, I will conclude, hopefully within time. So the motivation on an aggregate level, now this is EU-wide. What we see is for the past decade or so that there's been pretty high numbers of people who are ordered to leave the EU each year. However, we have relatively low numbers of people that are actually returning after they have been ordered to leave. And here you can see the share, which is relatively small compared to the overall numbers. And as I said, this is EU-wide and on an aggregate level, but what questions evolve or emerge from these insights? I would say that first of all, so who leaves when they are ordered to leave, and when do they leave? And when they leave, do they do so voluntarily or forced? Of course, graphs like the one that I just showed you don't really tell us any answers on those questions. And then not only with regard to the people that return, but also with regard to the people that do not return, who are those that do not return, that stay? And so what is their alternative to leaving, right? Those are questions that kind of emerge from those facts that we've seen for the past decade or so. And then what does the literature tell us on these questions? So there's, of course, a body of return migration of rejected asylum seekers, but this body of the literature is pretty small. It's mostly qualitative, so we don't really have any like systematic large number analyses on those questions that I just posed. There's only one quantitative study from Arjen Leerkes, who's in Rotterdam, and he, on an individual level, basically shows the determinants of voluntary return in the Netherlands, but with data that is 15 to 20 years old. So we don't really know so much at this point about the return migration of specifically rejected asylum seekers. Of course, there's a body of literature on return migration in general, usually on regular migrants like students or labor migrants. And we do have some information on refugees and their return. However, this is usually placed in other contexts, for example, countries neighboring the countries of origin, like Lebanon or Jordan or so on. So of course, it's not really clear whether those findings are valid also for rejected asylum seekers in a European context or a German context, even more specifically. And also those studies usually have a pretty unidimensional focus on return and don't so much look at the people that do not return, but they stay, the people that stay. And then there's the third body of literature on immobility, where it's usually distinguished between voluntary and involuntary mobility. Carling and Schevel are, names here. And again, there's a caveat, I would say, that usually this literature is only on out migration, so the migration out of the source country, and not so much about return migration. So we do have some insights, of course, but there are considerable research gaps with regard to the immobility of rejected asylum seekers in particular. And also we do not know so much about the policy effects of migration policies that tackle rejected asylum seekers, which could be, for example, regularization policies or coercion and restriction policies. So the research question that, like, against this backdrop that I'm trying to tackle with this research is whether, when, and how do rejected asylum seekers terminate their obligation to leave the country? And here, as I said, a very brief legal background. So when somebody files an asylum application in Germany, but also in other countries, they can either be recognized, of course, or the application can be rejected. Once it's rejected, the person can go to court, it can appeal against the decision, and then can be either recognized then, or he or she receives their final rejection, which comes along with a return decision. And this return decision basically poses the obligation to leave the country. And once they have basically their final decision and they have to leave the country legally, they can either return voluntarily, they can be deported, so return in a forced manner. They can be regularized and receive a residence permit, or they can also file a subsequent asylum application. And once the agency basically finds that there's enough reasons to file another application, then they get something like a residence permit. So that's also a way, if it's accepted, the subsequent application, then it's a way to well, stay in a legal manner. Or, of course, they can basically stay despite their obligation to leave, which in a way is a irregular stay. However, in Germany, we do have something that is called the Duldung, which translates roughly into a tolerated stay. And what this means is that the legal obligation to leave the country persists, but the state basically suspends the deportation of that person. So it's really something like a legal gray area. On the one side, they're illegally, but on the other side, the deportation is just not enforced. And I think this is something rather peculiar for Germany. Yeah, and what it means is that basically lots of rejected asylum seekers just stay for considerable times in Germany. And as for now or for last year, just to give you a rough estimation of how many persons this applies to. So there were about 250,000 persons in Germany that had the obligation to leave the country, and of those, about 200,000 stayed, were there with a Duldung. All right. So the data that this research is based on, as I've said, comes from the Central Register of Foreigners. Again, this is, I think, a German thing. Not every country has this. The abbreviation in German is AZR for Ausländerzentralregister. And it basically contains data for all foreign nationals who are in Germany for a longer period, so for more than 3 months, or everybody who has filed an asylum application in Germany. And it contains data on their residence status, their asylum status, some socio-demographic data. And what is really interesting from a research perspective is that this information is stored in a longitudinal way, which can be exploited for research purposes. Usually this data is not available for researchers, but since I'm part of the agency, I can use it, luckily. We do have a research data center now, and for anybody who's interested, there's like a subsample of the AZR, so a 20% sample that is available to researchers. I think so far it's only for researchers from German institutions, probably for data protection issues, but yeah, at least it's available to research in one or the other kind. So, and then the data set that I focus on, it spans a period of 10 years from 2013 to 2022. The reason of this 10-year time span is regulations about data deletion after 10 years. So I couldn't go further back, but yeah, still it's a fairly long period, and also it's very recent. And the data set includes all irregular stays after final asylum rejection that kind of are in that period. So it's basically like a full census. It's not a subsample or anything, but it just contains all irregular stays. And I do have data on entry, exit, the asylum procedure, the residence permits, and tolerated stay, the Duldung. And yeah, as I've said, it's in longitudinal format, so it allows for really interesting insights into the whole temporal dynamics. And yeah, so what I did here is basically it's a relatively exploratory and descriptive analysis at this point. And what I really wanted to look at is the temporal dynamics of the patterns that we see. And now it's getting a bit methodological, but basically there are multiple events, right? So as I've said, there are 4 ways that people can end their obligation to leave. They can do so voluntarily, they can be forced, like deported, they can get a residence permit, or they can file a subsequent asylum application, or there could also be no event, which would mean they would just stay on in this irregular status. And those 4 ways, they are mutually exclusive. That means that only one of them can take place during one stay, right? You can either return but then you cannot no longer be regularized, of course. And those events are also non-recurrent. So once you end your irregular status, then it's ended and you cannot end it in another way. And so from a methods perspective, what this means, given like this data structure or this those concepts, I chose to apply event history analysis, which is also known as survival analysis, with competing risks. And the competing risks, so basically each person in an irregular status in Germany after rejected asylum claim has the risk of ending the irregular stay by one of those 4 events. It's not really a risk, but it's just called that way because it comes like more from medical studies and so on, where you are at the risk of dying. So that's where the method comes from. It's not really a risk in my case. And then basically the results of this method is what's called a cumulative incidence curve, which basically is a summary probability of experiencing one of those events. Okay. And now I'm going to show you on 4 slides some of the results that I found. So first, regarding the overall probability of ending an irregular stay. So basically summarizing all of the 4 kinds of ending an irregular stay. What we see here is the cumulative incidence curve, and I'm just going to briefly explain it. So on the x-axis, we see the length of the irregular stay in years. So it can be only half a year, or it can have lasted already 5 years or 8 years and so on. And then on the y-axis, we basically see the summed probability that a person has ended their irregular stay in one of those 4 ways by a given time. So when I give you an example, for example, by 3 years, when you take the point of 3 on the x-axis, it means that the probability that a person has ended the irregular stay in whichever way that the person has ended their irregular stay within the time of 3 years after they have been rejected is at about 50%, meaning again, like the inverse, that it's about 50% that the irregular stay lasts longer than those 3 years. And when we look at 8 years, we see that even over 20%, the irregular stay lasts longer than 8 years. So just to kind of summarize the findings we see from this graph is there, for lots of people, there are actually really considerable periods of irregularity that they stay in Germany, even though they legally are obliged to leave. And then also what we see is that the highest dynamic is within the first 2 years after rejection. And we see that because the line is steepest there, right? So when it's steep, it means lots of things are happening. And then it flattens considerably. So once you've stayed for like 2 years or more, the probability that a person will actually end their irregular stay decreases over time. Okay, now it gets a bit more complicated or complex. Now the same thing, but differentiated by the types of how people can end their obligation to leave. And the gray line on top is basically the same line that we've just seen. And then below that line are the 4 types of ending an irregular stay. And the green line I don't think I can point here, but the green line that's like the upmost of those four colored lines is the one for voluntary return. So what we see is that in absolute magnitude, voluntary return, but also a residence permit, so regularization, which is the dark blue line, they, like in absolute numbers, they have the same relevance in ending an irregular stay. So they are both, they are both the most common ways to ending an irregular stay after a final rejection. However, we do see considerable differences in their dynamics, right? The voluntary return happens basically quickly after a person has been finally rejected. And if they don't leave within like 2 years, then nothing changes anymore, right? The green line flattens almost completely. So nothing really happens anymore after those 2 years, while regularization takes quite a while. So people stay in an irregular status, and then after several years, the probability that they will be regularized increases. And compared to that, the other two ways of ending an irregular status don't really play such a big role. After 10 years, it's about a probability of 10% that people have been deported, and only not even 3% that people have basically gotten an irregular stay because of filing a subsequent asylum application. Okay, so now I'm going to differentiate what we see here by country of origin. And the plots get even more complex, and we don't need to look at each plot, so don't be scared once you see this, although it gets a bit small. So on what we see here is different patterns by country of origin. And on the left side, the left column, so to say, all of these are countries from the Western Balkans. And on the right side, it's other countries of origin where there's lots of rejected asylum seekers in Germany. So it's basically by frequency. On the right side, it's, I don't know if you can see it, it's probably pretty small, but it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, and Russia. It's also in German. But so just to point out what's like most obvious when we look at this graph is that the patterns for rejected asylum seekers from the West Balkan countries, they're similar amongst each other, but they vary a lot from what we've just seen on the overall scale, but also they vary a lot from what we see from, well, the other frequent countries. From people from the West Balkans, they return voluntarily, most of them do, and they do so very quickly. So the curve is very steep in the beginning, right? So when they get their rejected asylum, they get their rejection on their asylum claim, usually, or the probability is very high that they leave voluntarily very quickly within the first year or something after a rejection. And for other frequent countries, actually it's regularization that is the most likely way to end the irregular status. But as we've seen before, regularization usually takes several years before it materializes. So this is basically what we can learn from this very complex graph. And now I'm going to show you another graph, which is similar to this one, also complex. But this time I differentiate by the type of the Duldung that people get. So in the past few years, the Duldung has been differentiated in quite substantial ways. So there's not only one type of Duldung people can get, but there's different types of the Duldung. And for example, there's two types that are based on employment or apprenticeship. And the aim of that type of the Duldung is that after some years with that type of the Duldung, people actually should be regularized. And then there's another type of the Duldung, which is meant to sanction those rejected asylum seekers that don't really cooperate with clarifying their identity or getting travel documents. So when they don't cooperate or are sought to not cooperate, they should be sanctioned. They're not allowed to work, and they get often even less social benefits. They have to stay in one place, and so on. So that's the parts of the sanctions they get. And what we see now is each graph basically is a different type of the Duldung. And on the bottom right side, again, it's a very specific pattern. Those are the people that do not have any Duldung at all, right? So they are obliged to leave, and their deportation is not suspended. And what we see is that they leave voluntarily right away, or they have the most likelihood to leave, to put it in a correct way. Then when we see the tolerated stay based on employment and apprenticeship, what I said, they're usually meant to be regularized after a couple of years. We do see that that's actually the case. They have the largest share of being regularized, and those are the bottom left graph and the one on the right side in the middle, where it's like the dark blue line prevails very obviously. So once people get this type of the Duldung, it actually kind of serves the value it's made for. People are regularized. However, in absolute numbers, it's relatively rarely issued. So it's not so many people that get that type of the Duldung. But once they get it, they're very likely to be regularized. And then the tolerated stay with the sanctions, which is the one in the middle on the left side, we actually see it does not really seem to fulfill its purpose, because the people that have that type of the Duldung have a higher probability compared to the other rejected asylum seekers to just stay in their irregular status. So they have the lowest probability of ending their irregular stay and basically just stay on even for more than 10 years. So I would argue that it doesn't really fulfill its purpose of, well, making them leave or making them cooperate or whatever. And then now, briefly concluding, I started with the aggregate level observation that there's a discrepancy between return orders and actual returns of rejected asylum seekers in the EU, but it's the same in Germany. We do have so far relatively little knowledge about who returns and when do they return, about those that stay, and about policy effects geared towards rejected asylum seekers. And against this backdrop, I seek to contribute to better understanding, well, the dynamics in ending irregularity after a rejection and the relevance of individual and policy factors. And as I've said, this has been published so far as something like a policy brief, but I'm currently working on transferring it into an academic paper. So if you have any hints at, I don't know, literature, theory, or any additional points you would think would be worth looking into, feel free to tell me. And then thank you for your attention. Just very briefly, feel free to stay in touch. Feel free to subscribe to the newsletter of the Research Center. I'm afraid I think most of the contents are in German, but you will manage. And also, our project is going to have a closing conference next May, and we're going to have a call for papers, I think, in September. So, of course, I would be happy to welcome you there. Feel free to come and attend. All right. And I'm going to stop here. And I think...
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Laura, for this really interesting and very clear presentation of your research. So we've got a few people in the room and a few more online. I will first turn to the people in the room for questions and then go to the online audience. So Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It was super interesting. I had one clarifying question and then one bigger question. The first was, am I understanding correctly that the start of their irregular stay starts after they're denied their asylum application? And then the second, I was wondering, when you compared both the Western Balkan countries of origin with the other ones, and then when you did the kind of deeper dive on slide 18 of if they were granted the name that I can't pronounce. Yep. What type of inequities or discrepancies did you see between possible statuses or possible countries of origin, or did you? Were there, maybe you could just talk more about the differences between the countries, the Western Balkan countries and the other ones, because it appeared that there were key differences or perhaps inequities in how that was being administered.
In twos, and then you can, is that okay if you collect two questions? Yeah, Friedrich, and then, yeah. Was first, sorry, I didn't, go ahead.
My question is related to this, so maybe you can clarify. I was wondering, so I know that in Germany for return of asylum seekers, there were programs in the origin countries to attract the returnees. And I think this has been rolled out in the Balkans actually quite well. And there's a system of connecting the potential returnees already with origin country organizations and networks. I know that this has been tried to set up for Afghanistan as well, but I'm not sure. So maybe there's a clue as why voluntary return, so to say, works better in a specific set of countries than in others. That's my comment.
All right, thank you. Okay, first a clarifying question, which is very easy to answer. Yeah, the irregular stay, as I did it here, is basically when they get their final rejection. So if they appealed in court after the court kind of, how do you say, confirmed the rejection, that's when the period starts. In newer rounds, like newer data of the register of foreigners, it's actually possible to, I do have the information, the final or the rejection, and then whether they appealed, and then the final rejection. And I would really like to kind of exploit this information, but it started to be available, I think, in 22 or something. So it wasn't really possible to exploit that information yet. Yes. I do have the information also when they entered, so I could look also at the entire length of the stay, which might be interesting. In an addition, I have to think about it, but for now, I only focused on the time of the irregular stay after final rejection. Okay, so with regard to the Western Balkans, what I see is that they have a much higher probability of returning voluntarily and doing so very quickly. There's very low regularization rates compared to other countries, for example. Why, for example, for Afghanistan and Iraq, the probability that they will be regularized eventually is much, much higher. It makes sense that regularization takes a while because usually for the residence permits that kind of can apply in those cases, people need to have been in Germany, for example, for 5 years. So that's one of the conditions they have to fulfill together with language skills, employment, and so on. But then there are some like times that they have to have stayed there. So it makes sense that it cannot happen basically right away. Except that maybe a rejection would take 5 years, like it would take 5 years for somebody to be actually rejected, then they would have fulfilled their 5 years already. So as to why we see those patterns, I haven't really, so far I haven't really gone into really explaining it because as you've seen, it's descriptives, right? It's not really multivariate. I'm not running any multivariate models, which is, well, the main reason is that when I want to look at the temporal dynamics, as I've said, I need to apply event history analysis, and I do have competing risks. So I do have several events, as I explained in the beginning. And with this constellation, it's well, basically impossible to really do it in a multivariate manner. Or if you know any ways to do it, let me know. I've tried in the beginning. So if I want to do it in a multivariate manner, I would kind of have to take out the whole temporal dimension. So I wouldn't really know so much when does it happen, or I would have to focus on return versus everything else, right? I would have to kind of make the variable like in a dummy variable, a dichotomous variable. So I would always kind of lose information. And for that reason, for this stage, I chose to, well, kind of try to make it like, to incorporate the whole dynamics, but with the downside of not really being able to run a multivariate model and being less able, I think, to say something about the reasons or the mechanisms that are behind this. And Tobias, you mentioned some of the potential mechanisms that would lie behind it. For example, in the Western Balkans, as you've said, I think it was in 2016, there was a Western Balkan regulation, it's called, basically trying to reduce the numbers of asylum claims from people from the Western Balkans where they have very low chances to get asylum, and offering them, legal pathways basically into Germany based on labor migration. And then, of course, there's also voluntary return programs, what you mentioned as well, right? Where they, offer people financial incentives or whatever you want to call them to return. in addition with reintegration support and so on. So I think, yeah, what I do see is, and I didn't show this now, but what I do see is that when I differentiate, for example, the time frame from 2012 to 16 versus afterwards, I think, if I remember correctly, I do see different patterns for people from the Western Balkans, for example. But yeah, maybe I could show this a bit more without like making a causal claim that it's definitely the cause for the patterns we see, but it definitely plays a role. Yeah. Awesome.
All right, thank you. I'll take one more round of questions in the room here. If you're joining us online and if you have a question, I'll come to you very soon. So you can either write your questions in the chat, or actually it's a reasonably small group, so you can also just ask your question in a few minutes. So I'll take one more round here. I think I have Friedrich and Friedrich, go ahead.
I'm Tomáš Beňuška from Matyabel University. I'm visiting here. Thank you for your presentation. So I got this notion that this Duldung it's unofficial, right? Is it unofficial policy or? Yeah. Okay. And well, when it comes to rejecting the asylum claims, there's usually some basis to this. So isn't it a security issue to leave the rejected people working or something like that? Thank you.
Yes, also from my side, thanks a lot for this work. I think a lot more evidence is needed in that field and that context and how to come by. So it's great to see. Clarifying question, how when somebody's classified as having left the country, how do we know that actually? Or put differently, when somebody's just missing in the data, we don't know where the person is, what happened, how are they classified? And leaving the country might also mean going to France, for example. So, and another thing is, interesting to see that once people have stayed for a while, they become less and less likely to leave the irregular status. But this reminds me of findings from labor economics about unemployment. Once you're in there for a while, once you become long-term unemployed after, I think by definition, after a year, you become less and less likely to leave that unemployment status unless there's some pressure at some point. So this is the so-called duration dependence. I mean, it might be useful for you to sort of draw on that literature, just why I mentioned it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? And that I'll just add two questions, Laura. Just for information again, can you talk a little bit more about voluntary return? I mean, what that means in practice? So do you know what share of this voluntary return is facilitated through voluntary return programs, or is it all of it? So are people actually, I don't know, does somebody pay for the plane ticket from somebody to fly home or not? I think if you could say a little bit about that, that'd be helpful. And briefly on the regularization part. So what are these fairly structured and permanent policies that exist that say basically after 10 years somebody can on an individual basis regularize their status? If you could just talk a little bit about that as well, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Not sure if I understood you correctly. Is your question whether it is a security issue for letting those people stay in a way officially, right? So I don't know if you follow like the German discourse, but sometimes there are incidences exactly of this group, right? Rejected asylum seekers that are staying nonetheless. And then just recently, actually, I'm not sure if he was rejected, but like a policeman was killed at a demonstration, or another time, like there was a stabbing in a train. So it always boils up again that why do we have these people here? Because they're a security threat. But well, I would argue it's a relatively low share compared to the overall population of rejected asylum seekers. So I don't really want to claim or make any claims about whether or not it's a security issue. I mean, it is an official policy, and there are reasons why they get the Duldung. So they can get the Duldung for real reasons, it's called. Then it's because they don't have any travel documents, or there's no diplomatic connection to the country of origin, for example, with well, Afghanistan is a different case because it's also so insecure. But, you know, if there would just be no planes flying to a country, then of course it's difficult to deport those people. Or if they don't have travel documents, it's difficult. Or if the country of origin doesn't accept to take back the rejected asylum seekers, then again, you cannot really return them. So in those real cases, people can get a Duldung. And then there's also like individual reasons, for example, medical issues that the person just cannot travel, or family reasons, that somebody from the family has a residence permit, and then in that case the person can get a Duldung. Yeah, so there's lots of different reasons why people can get a Duldung, but there is a reason, right? It's not ambiguous or whatever. And then how do we know if the people have actually left that I've classified as having left? That's a very valid question. So in the data, when a person leaves and basically deregisters with the authorities, then it's entered as this in the data. And then I know for sure the person has left. We don't necessarily know whether the person has returned then, that's true, but at least we know that they have, well, officially left. And then there's a second code, so to say, in the data, when it's not entirely sure, they have not deregistered, they're basically just not there anymore. Which could mean they are not in Germany anymore. It could also mean they have absconded. I think I had it on one of the slides, but I didn't go into detail here. And what I did to kind of minimize the risk that I'm classifying persons that have actually absconded as having left is that, well, most of the people I look at, they do have the Duldung. The Duldung is only valid usually for 3 months or sometimes 6, but mostly between 3 and 6 months. So they have to go to the authorities and to basically renew it very regularly. And so if they have absconded within, like, for just, sometimes it happens that people are just not where they're supposed to be for like 2 weeks or something, then it's also entered in the data that they have left. But I wouldn't count those cases as having left, but because they have kind of like show themselves to the authorities again and again to renew their Duldung, I would argue that when somebody has left or is entered as having left to the unknown for a certain time frame, they have actually left the country. There might be some cases that have actually absconded, but I think it's a very low share of the people that I classify as having left. And you're right, we cannot be sure that they have actually returned. So they might have also gone to France or whatever your example was. So maybe I should rephrase and not say they have returned, but they have left, which from a German perspective is the same, but from an individual perspective is not. And then thank you for the suggestion. I'm going to look into it. With regard to the voluntary return or voluntary leave or whatever, I don't have any information whether it's via a adjusted program or not. I think it's again one of those variables that now would be included in the newer data, but it hasn't been included for the past years, so I couldn't really exploit that information as well. Yeah, so it would be people that just leave. It would be people that would leave. There's very many different return programs in Germany. Some are on the like federal level, some are on the Länder level, and so on. So there's different programs, but I don't really know whether they have, yeah, in which way they have left. And with regard to regularization policies, so it used to be the case, yeah, those policies basically they are not temporal. Usually they persist and basically say, yeah, when somebody has been there for 5 years usually and fulfills other conditions as well, they can get a residence permit. In some cases, especially for younger people, it can even be shortened to 3 years to then be regularized. Always once they fulfill those conditions, and that has been in place for the past, I don't know how many years, but it's not a one-time thing. And now what we have now with what they only introduced at the end of 22, so it came into effect in the beginning of 23, is basically a one-off policy. Yeah, it's only valid right now. So saying that when people have been there for 5 years to a certain deadline, I think it was in, yeah, whatever, 22 something, yeah. So if by that deadline they have been there for 5 years, they can get a residence permit it's called an opportunity residence permit. So they can get this opportunity residence permit, which is then valid for 18 months. And then they have time within those 18 months to learn the language or improve their language skills, to find a job that kind of suffices for their livings. And yeah, and to also get basically their travel or identity documents or prove their identity. And if they fulfill those conditions by the time of once the 18 months end, then they can get a residence permit. So this has been something very new. And what is, I think, striking about it, that it does include the people, as I've said, that have like the sanctioned Duldung. So the people that before that didn't really have any perspective of being regularized. And they've always been in a dilemma, because to be regularized, of course, you need to prove your identity, but there's always been the risk once you prove your identity, they might deport you. So, you know, they've always been in like this dilemma. Should I say who I am and show them my passport, or get a passport if I don't have one anymore? But then I'm at the risk of being deported. And now what they changed, or with this new policy, it actually applies to those persons as well that haven't proven their identity yet. So they could use those 18 months to prove their identity, and they are safe for those 18 months without having the risk of being deported, and then they can be regularized. So yeah, we'll see how it turns out.
Okay, thank you. Just one very quick question for clarification again before we go to the online audience. If somebody cannot be returned because of non-refoulement, how would they be clarified? Would they, like, if because the country is not safe, the asylum application has been rejected, but they cannot be returned for legal reasons, would they be Duldung as well? They would also be this type of Duldung. Okay, so your answer is yes. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'd like to, if anybody online would like to say something, then please just, I suggest just unmute yourself and ask your question. We also have one question in the chat here. So maybe while people are thinking online, I'll just go through these questions. Of Robert is asking 3 questions. First of all, how long does the asylum procedure take? Whether asylum seekers can legally work or apply for social benefits? And once they're rejected, if they can work and apply for benefits while being irregular. So maybe you could just take those.
Okay, the first questions. I'm honestly, I'm not entirely sure how long it takes. I think it kind of depends also on the time, right? When it was like 2016, 17, it took longer. Now that numbers have gone down, it's quicker again. But I cannot really tell you a specific number, because I'm not really looking so much into this period. I know that once they appeal and they go to court, they appeal against the decision. That often takes very long. It takes up to 2 years just for the courts to process this, just because there's such a huge backlog. And now it's actually in the debate how it can be reduced. Different courts and also it's a federal system, so in different länder, or different states within Germany, they are thinking about how to change this. Now the idea is to basically have judges specialize on different countries of origin to kind of speed up the process. But it's really in the debate right now because it's such a big backlog. But I'm sorry, I cannot really tell you a specific number here. Then the second question, yes, asylum seekers can work, I think, after 3 months of having been in Germany. So they can work, definitely. And they don't need to apply for social benefits. They do get social benefits. They don't, once they are still in their claim is still processed, they don't get, I think, the full amount that citizens would get. But they do get social benefits, like under different laws. So it's a bit, it's lower. And again, if you have followed the German discourse, they're now, so usually they would get just cash. And now they're actually changing it because of the whole discourse. They're changing it to giving them like a Visa card that has a limited amount per month, and they can pay with it in stores. And they can only withdraw, I think, 50 euros each month in cash. Yes, not saying any more about this. And once they are rejected, they can work, except some exceptions. As I've said, they've differentiated the whole Duldung system a lot. They cannot work once they have the Duldung Light, the sanctioned Duldung. When they don't cooperate, then they cannot work. And when they come from safe countries of origin, including most of the Western Balkan countries and Senegal and Ghana, then they can also not work. And in this case, they also have to live in like communal asylum seeker housing. But the others can work legally, and they also get social benefits then. And once they have, they get like the asylum level social benefits that the asylum seekers get. And then I think after 18 months or so, I think even get the full amount. It increases after a while. Yes.
Thank you. And anybody else online have a question they would like to ask them? Please just unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, I don't see any questions at this stage. I'll just ask one more question, which is, so you said you published this as a policy brief already. So yeah, I'm wondering what the reactions to the policy brief have been, and I'm saying this partly because for somebody who doesn't, I mean, I think I've known the German system in a superficial way, but I wonder whether to the public it might actually come as a bit of a surprise that you have all these possibilities for regularization this on an individual basis, as you say, because often I think when we talk about regularization exercises, we have these temporary one-off policies in mind that are often very controversial. But then there are this, as you say, these more kind of structured permanent policies. So is that something that is being discussed in Germany? Do you think that is that and my second question would be, do you get any sense of what's the number of people who kind of truly, I think you've used the word who abscond in a way. I mean, given this, the people who really are not within the system, who are not part of the Duldung, who for some reason, do you have any idea of how big that group is? Because also from point of view, so they would be the ones who are outside the system, and also they have very few or limited rights then also in terms of work or benefit. And so do you have any indication of how big that group would be? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so how did the general public or the politics kind of receive the paper? So it was published while I was on maternity leave. So I finished it right before I left, so to say, or I went into maternity leave. And then I didn't follow up so much because, also we didn't make such a big deal out of it just because I wasn't there to respond to any questions. So we didn't really, usually, sometimes we have like a background talk with the media or something, and we didn't do it in this case just because I wasn't there and wasn't able to answer any questions. Also, the whole asylum and also deportation issue, again, it was published last fall, and the whole topic actually, it really did boil up last fall. And then they had like the ministers of the Länder, they had a meeting and they discussed different topics about it. And then the topic was really, it cooled down again right after they had their meeting. And I think it was published just like 2 weeks after or something. So I felt like it was just a bit too late maybe to really get into the discussion. But in general, and with your question of whether regularization is discussed or even known to the wider public, I feel like not so much actually. So usually the discussions are only about return and getting those people out and trying to increase the deportation rate. And now, because one of the people who did something was from Afghanistan. So now again, like we need to deport to Afghanistan, even though it's not safe, but maybe we can do it through Pakistan. And, like people, yeah, basically people who did a felony, they should be deported. And so this is always where the whole discussion, I think, is around. And not so much about the whole regularization. And even when this new law was introduced, it wasn't really widely, I mean, the regularization, the Opportunity Act, when this was introduced, even though it was such a paradigm shift, it wasn't really discussed that widely for whichever reasons. And And then how big is the group that that they have absconded? I don't know, of course, because it's really hard to know. I would guess that in Germany it's not that big compared to other countries, just because we have the Duldung, right? So people can stay in a semi-legal way and they can receive benefits and they can work and so on. So they wouldn't be as limited as if they absconded. So I would say it's not as large as it might be in other European countries, but of course we don't really know. And there've been, I'm sure you know, but there's been a project like a decade ago, so where they tried to estimate those numbers, and well, the estimation is pretty wide. It ranges from, I don't know, a couple of thousands or 100,000 to like 1 million or so. So it's a fairly wide range, and we don't really know.
All right, if there's no more questions, then I'd just like to thank you again, Laura, for a really interesting presentation, and we're all looking forward to seeing the academic paper develop. And thanks everybody online for joining us. This was the last seminar in our MPC seminar series this academic year, and I hope we will all see you back next year in the autumn. So bye-bye and have a nice day. Thank you.